So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with this recipe. My name is Jocelyn Ramirez. I'm the chef and founder of Todo Verde here in Los Angeles. I didn't ask where everybody else is tuning in from, which is always really cool to see too. So you can enter that into the chat if you'd like. And I started Todo Verde because I wanted to be able to create plant-based dishes that still felt like the dishes that I grew up eating, especially right now as we get into this holiday season, to be able to make tamales and pozole and ceviche and mole and like all the things that our communities really enjoy eating, but that weren't readily available in a plant-based version. And I started it back in 2015 with that mission to be able to create that food and also to have conversations about decolonizing foodways, about why our communities depend so much on meat and how our foodways have really transformed and evolved via colonization. A lot of times we call some of these foods our traditional foods, right? So like somebody might say, oh, pozole with pork is traditional. If it doesn't have the pork, it's actually not a traditional version of pozole. And that is incorrect. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But of course, pozole is an ancestral dish that we've had for generations prior to a lot of the meats that we have available here on this land now. So this recipe, if you have the book in front of you, I published La Vida Verde earlier this year. It's a plant-based cookbook with 60 recipes in it. And this particular recipe is on page 45. So I'll give you kind of all the ins and outs of what I like to do, because I know it's, I try to give as much instruction on, on paper here, but of course, me being here with you in person will be a little bit of an additional perk so that you can ask any questions about the process along the way. So first things first, I want to talk about the pozole itself, the maize. And so I am using a white corn that I purchased dried, and I forgot to pull it out of my cupboard. Let me grab it really quick. And it is not there when over here. So this pozole, I purchased this pozole online at Native Seeds. It is one of the vendors that are referenced in the back of the book. If you do have the book available, there's a bunch of online vendors where you can pick up some of these ingredients online and get them shipped directly to you. So I'm using here a white corn pozole. I also use their blue corn pozole. If you're based in Los Angeles, hopefully Kernel of Truth Organics is gonna have their blue corn and yellow corn maize available for purchase at the small stores that they sell at, which are Cookbook Market in Echo Park and Highland Park. They also sell at Sarah's Market in City Terrace and Grassroots Market in South Pasadena. So I know that they carry some of their products, but that's our Todo Verde preferred vendor. So if we're using dry corn, then we typically use this Los Chileros brand from Native Seeds. Otherwise, we use the nixtamalized corn that Kernel of Truth sells typically wholesale to vendors like Todo Verde or to food businesses like Todo Verde. So of course, this is organic, non-GMO. You want to get something that's, non-GMO, at least hopefully organic, so that you know that you're getting like a pretty good product. And Native Seeds is an organization that I really love because they're focusing on, of course, native seeds, on trying to use as much organic, non-GMO products, and really keeping the seed trade as like, I guess, wholesome, pure as possible. So I really love the products that they sell, highly recommend them. And this is a 12-ounce package. Just full disclosure, I'm making half of the recipe that is in the book today, just because I didn't want to make a huge pot of pozole for really just me. So I'm cutting it down to half. So I only use one 12-ounce package of this white corn pozole. And they've already gone through the process of nixtamalizing the corn. So if you happen to buy dry corn that has not gone through nixtamal, then you have an additional step to do. And I included it in the notes for the class, but essentially you would have to, as of the day before, put your corn, your dry corn, in a cal or calcium solution. It's typically this really fine white powder It's ground limestone typically. And what that does is it creates a reaction with the corn. If you just bring it to hot, you know, like it doesn't have to come to a rolling boil. Like if you just bring it to a hot temperature, turn off the flame, let your corn sit in the cal overnight in that hot liquid, with the heat off, it'll obviously cool down. And then, for example, this morning, I would have been draining that, rinsing it off, and rubbing the corn in between your hands. And that removes the outer shell of the corn, which is kind of tough on digestion. And so that's what nixtamal does, is it kind of disintegrates the exterior shell of the corn. And then you get left with just the corn itself without the skin on it. And so they've already done this for us, and then they dried the corn again. So they saved us a great deal of time. However, because it's still dry, last night I did soak my corn in just water, and it soaked all night. And then this morning, about 2 hours before class, I went ahead and drained that soaking liquid out, gave the corn a rinse a couple times. I filled up the pot with enough water to coat the corn with about 2 inches of water above the corn. And then I put it on my stove on about medium heat. And I've been keeping an eye on it, and just making sure that it continues to have about a couple inches of water on it. I also put about a tablespoon of salt in there. So it's just cooking in salt water is all it's doing. So I do have a second camera set up, and hopefully it's not too wobbly over here. Let me adjust it slightly. And if you look over here, you will see what my dry nixtamal corn is looking like. I do need to add more liquid. It is pretty much just barely covered in the water. And you can see here that it's gone from these really small, you know, kernels of corn here to, it's probably expanded about 2, almost 3 times the size. And I'm going to add a little bit more liquid just to make sure that it continues to stay submerged in water, and that the kernels that are not submerged in water don't get dried out. So you just keep adding water as you go and just keeping an eye on it. So I just have my blender cup here, which I'm going to use later. I'm just grabbing, you could use filtered water, you could use tap water, whatever you have available. And just make sure that you have your maize covered. Let me add just a little bit more. And I usually add about 2 inches, as I mentioned, of liquid above. As it's getting this close to cooking, this now becomes kind of up to you if you want it to be a little bit looser, if you want your pozole to be a little bit thicker, but I like a good amount of looseness with my pozole. So I'm gonna let that continue to simmer as we get our other ingredients going. So if you are working with your pozole right now, please let me know if you have any questions about that process. It's pretty simple. It's just time, right? It's just a little bit of time, just going back and making sure that everything's cooking okay, that you're not burning anything, that you didn't run out of liquid in there. And the other main ingredient that we're gonna work with is our jackfruit. So I'm gonna prepare our jackfruit and talk a little bit about it before I start getting into the chiles for the pozole, just so we can kind of work simultaneously. So if this is your first time working with jackfruit, and you got canned jackfruit, make sure that you drain it out of the can or the pouch or whatever it came in. Make sure that, again, it's a young green jackfruit, as it mentioned in the recipe. That's really important. I've seen some people who are like, I bought this whole fresh jackfruit at the Asian market, and that's awesome. But just know that typically, because jackfruit is grown in tropical regions in Asia, in Mexico, by the time it's cut off the tree and imported here to the United States, it means that there's typically been some sort of ripening that's happened, that the sugars have developed in this jackfruit. And so now you're looking at this sweet tropical flavored jackfruit that doesn't really work for a savory recipe like this. So make sure, again, that you're using young green jackfruit. I am using 1.5 cans. I actually ended up just using the 2 because what's another half, right? If you're making the full recipe, it would be 3 20-ounce cans of jackfruit. And when you open the jackfruit out of the can, I like to strain it in a strainer. You can just dump the liquid out, put it in a bowl, give it a really good rinse with water. And then you'll have these triangular pieces. They're kind of pale in color. They have a slight green hue on the top. And they're filled with liquid, with water and brine and, you know, everything that was used essentially to kind of stop them from ripening, which is usually just like water, salt, citric acid. And so I like to squeeze as much of that out before I start breaking down my jackfruit, because I don't want any of that flavor in my pozole. I want to try to remove all of that and just get left with the texture of the jackfruit, which is a nice meaty texture. And then you want to season it up as well or as much as you want to. My seasoning here is really, really simple and straightforward, but you can always add more, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm just going to pan down for a moment to just show you my cutting board and how I break down the jackfruit. So first things first is it's already been drained and rinsed, like I mentioned. Then I like to put the jackfruit into my hands like so and just give it a really good squeeze. And you'll see that there's quite a bit of this liquid that's coming out of the jackfruit. So I've seen a lot of videos where people are cooking jackfruit and they literally just like open the can, maybe they rinse it, and then they throw the whole chunks of jackfruit into the pan. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Because I think that this is an important step. It's kind of like if you were to open like a really soggy, you know, container of tofu, for example, and you didn't try to remove as much of that liquid, you just threw that like wet tofu, soaking wet tofu into your pan. You're gonna get some of that liquid that is gonna dilute your flavors slightly. So I wanna remove as much of this as possible. And you can see here all this liquid that's remaining or getting squeezed out. So again, it doesn't take too much work. You can use a cheesecloth here. You can use a nut milk bag. And then the amount of dryness, this is another question I get often, is like, how dry is it supposed to be? I mean, it doesn't have to be bone dry. I think people are looking for it to get like super dry. You just want to try to get as much of the liquid out. You know, it's not like, oh, you should have squeezed it like 5 more seconds or even harder. Just wherever you're at. Like this is obviously still slightly moist, but it's not soaking wet. Like now when I squeeze it, there's not all this like liquid coming out of it. So you squeeze it as much as you feels good for you. And so once I've squeezed that jackfruit, what I like to do is break it down. And let me show you an example here that I should have showed you right before, but you can still see it here. So this jackfruit in this triangular shape, you'll see that the top portion of the jackfruit, or the top half of it, is this like nice shreddable piece of jackfruit. This is the texture that a lot of people love jackfruit for, because it's very much like a shredded pork, shredded chicken. And then you'll see that there's this triangular core piece here that's holding that shreddable piece of jackfruit together. This still tastes just like the top piece. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a knife to cut at this line to remove this core piece. And then I'm also gonna remove any of these like large seed pods that are in the top portion of the jackfruit. And the reason I'm removing all of this is mostly because it's a textural thing. You know, I don't like the look of these huge seed pods in my jackfruit. So I wanna give it as much of this like shreddy, broken down bits of jackfruit texture. So it just kind of looks right versus having a big old triangular piece in there. So all I do is I use my knife to cut down that line. I check this for any more seed pods. And essentially I'm starting to make a couple piles here. I have a pile of jackfruit that still needs to be broken down a little bit, pile of jackfruit that's essentially pretty ready to go. And then I have my pile that still needs to be looked at or looked through. So again, just kind of looking through, there's a huge seed pod here. And I just want to make sure that this is still going to get broken up and that I'm going to get all the bits of my jackfruit incorporated into this dish. I've seen some people throw that jackfruit away. Like they're like, oh, that looks weird. I'm not going to use that. I'm just going to throw it away. Don't do that. That's so much food waste. And like I said, it tastes just like the top piece of the jackfruit. So it's going to taste really good. You just have to do a little bit of work to get the texture right. So again, just cutting down at that line and then separating the bits of jackfruit that are ready from the pieces of jackfruit that still need a little bit of work. Last piece here, and I've already broken down a majority of my jackfruit just so that I can focus on the rest of the class and not really so much on just breaking down jackfruit, because this could take a little bit of time. So if you're just cutting down jackfruit right now, no worries, no rush. Go ahead and break that down as needed, and I can always go through and repeat anything that you need to go over maybe in a few minutes after I do it. Totally okay. And one thing I will say is if you have a food processor, you can totally use a food processor to break down those larger bits of jackfruit that we're about to break down. I'm going to do it with my knife right now. But again, if you have a food processor, it'll be so much faster. And all I'm doing is bringing this pile to the center of my cutting board, and I'm just going to run my knife through it. So the bigger the chef's knife, the better, because you're going to be able to just rock your knife through this jackfruit rather than if you had a really small knife, you're not going to be able to kind of run it through in the same way. So a big knife is good here, a big chef's knife. And so essentially all I'm doing is I'm trying to get these larger bits just to start to get to the size where they're mimicking a little bit of that texture and that look and feel of the top portion of jackfruit. Of course, it's never going to look like a shredded piece of jackfruit, but it can get pretty close if I mince it up pretty well. And there's kind of a fine line, like my food processor that I have, it's actually a really little one, and it minces everything really tiny. Like it's like almost ground jackfruit. And I feel like that's a little bit too fine for me. It works, it's fine. But I still like to keep a little bit of texture here. And one of the reasons I like to do this, in addition to, just getting the look right, is also the flavor. I mentioned tofu earlier, and, for many of us who have tried tofu, we know that it's a really, really neutral flavored ingredient. It doesn't have very much flavor to begin with. And so when you cut the tofu, or you leave it whole even, or cut it even into like larger cubes, that you're flavoring the outside pretty well, but it doesn't really like penetrate the flavor. It doesn't really penetrate too well to the center. So you might have a piece of tofu that tastes really good on the outside, but then when you bite into it, it's still a pretty bland piece of tofu. Same thing goes for jackfruit. Jackfruit is also a really bland ingredient, and well, young green jackfruit, I should say, because sweet jackfruit is not bland at all, but young green jackfruit is super, super bland, which is why it's such a great ingredient, because you can really make it into so many different flavor profiles depending on the seasoning and the ingredients that you add to it. But if you have like a big chunk that you don't break down and you bite into it, you might have like a really delicious exterior piece of that jackfruit, and then you bite into it and it's like really bland in the center. So I don't want any bland jackfruit in this dish. I want to make sure that it's broken down enough where I know my seasoning is going to coat it really well, and it's going to all taste really delicious. Every bite will taste really good. So all I'm doing right now is I'm just running my hands through this jackfruit, and I'm checking to see if there's any big chunks that were on that top portion of the jackfruit. Sometimes they stay pretty big. And so all I'm doing is just using my hands to just hand shred so it breaks down a bit further. Perfect. And if I see any other big chunks, you can always break them down a little bit more as they're in the pan. But I just like to get a little bit of a head start and make sure as much of it is broken down as possible. All right, so I'm just gonna give my hands a quick rinse so they're not completely coated in jackfruit. I'm gonna season this up, and we're gonna get cooking on our stove again. Any questions so far? I forgot to mention that my colleague Sarah is here. So if you enter any questions into the chat box, Sarah will be reading those off as we go along, just to make sure I can keep cooking and listening to your questions.
Yeah, definitely did have a question earlier from Hermosa. She wanted to know if you could give some of the brands behind the ingredients that you're using. So you mentioned what you're using for the corn, but what kind of jackfruit are you using? Oh,
that's a great question. For the jackfruit, I'm using one that comes from Thailand. The brand is called, let me grab it so I can just show it to you. So it's called Choco, is the brand of the young green jackfruit. This is what you typically find at Asian markets for young green jackfruit. But now it's being sold everywhere from Whole Foods, Trader Joe's. I'm pretty sure they have it at, you know, Target and all these stores. You can also buy it online. You can get it at stores like Thrive Market. Again, if you have the book, you can always reference the back of the book for places that I recommend to buy certain ingredients such as jackfruit. But I find that this one, the texture is just right, because sometimes you'll find some jackfruit is a little bit more soft and squishy, and you know, some brands it's a little bit more thick and like more, I don't know what the right word is, like the structure holds up so much better than some of the other brands. So it really depends. This one I find is really, it works well for us. It's really affordable and it's pretty easy to find. So this is the brand I'm using of the jackfruit. And of course you can find, you know, a variety of different brands. You can find it organic, you can find it like, you know, all of the things. So definitely you can just look that up and find a variety of different ones. Okay, so any other questions? Are we good so far? Great. And I'll keep trying to go through the brands that I'm using. So going back to the jackfruit, all I'm gonna do is just season this jackfruit. So again, if you're doing the whole recipe, it's 3 cans of young green jackfruit, and we're gonna use 2 tablespoons of ground cumin. And I really like to use cumin in a lot of my recipes, but especially for jackfruit, because I think that it gives it a nice depth of flavor, something that kind of starts to give it that flavor that emulates the meaty flavor. So I like to put a good amount of cumin, as you can see, into this recipe. Let me make sure to get all of it there. I'm gonna grab a spatula. And I'm going to also use some oil. So I'm using some cooking oil here. Again, if you're making the full recipe, you're gonna use about ½ a cup of cooking oil. I'm using a ¼ cup here. And I'm using just some grapeseed oil. I like to use grapeseed oil because I just find that it has like a nice high cooking temperature. So I can cook this jackfruit at a medium high heat without the oil starting to burn. A lot of people I hear are cooking with extra virgin olive oil, which I don't typically cook with because extra virgin olive oil doesn't have as high of a heat point or smoke point, which means like once it gets too hot, it starts to burn. So it's more for me a finishing oil. However, you could use just a regular olive oil, not extra virgin, but a regular olive oil could potentially cook at a higher temperature. And the last thing I'll add here is just a little bit of salt. So it's gonna be salt to taste. It's really up to you. I'm using here just a flaky kosher salt. I put quite a bit in there, but like I said, this is like a super neutral flavor. So you have to give it a little something to start to give it like a nice balancing flavor that's gonna go well with the dish. And that's all I'm adding to the jackfruit. It's really simple. You can keep adding more to this if you'd like. You can add, if you have mushroom powder on hand, if you have a little bit of liquid aminos, if you wanted to add, you know, I have a bunch of different pastes in my fridge that I like to use. You know, I have a mushroom paste, I have a vegetable paste, you know, obviously tomato paste. You can add all of these things to flavor your jackfruit even more if you'd like. So again, really just like a baseline for how to flavor a jackfruit for a dish like this, and then you can keep going from there. So I'm just mixing it all in, making sure that everything's pretty well incorporated. And then I'm going to put this into my skillet. But before I do that and start cooking the jackfruit, just in the effort to not wash as many dishes, I'm going to cook my chiles in the skillet right before so that I can use them for the same thing, for the jackfruit and the chiles. So I'm going to, before going back over to my stove, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the chiles. So the chiles are obviously the star of this dish, right? Like it's the maize, it's the jackfruit, but the chiles are really what give it a flavor that makes it a really special pozole dish. So I'm using here ancho chiles, which obviously are called ancho because they're a little bit wide. That's what it translates to. So they're these slightly wider chiles. They're dried poblano chiles. And then I also have these more narrow guajillo chiles. So I've already gone through and took off the stem, removed as many of the seeds as I could, and gave them a rinse. So you can see they're just slightly moist. When looking for chiles, you wanna look for ones that have a little bit of a give. So you can see here that they're a little bit pliable. They're not gonna just like break as I try to bend them, because that means that they're probably a little bit too dried out. You can still use them, but they're not as fresh, I would say. So you wanna get some chiles that have a little bit of this give to them. And the anchos, for me, give a nice body to the pozole broth and a nice color. So they're obviously gonna give this like darker, deep red color. And the flavor is not really too spicy. It's more of what I like to say is like a cross between a raisin and a chile. So it's gonna give this like nice kind of earthy, sweet, slight spicy balance. And then the guajillos are a little bit more spicy. And in fact, I find that the smaller the chiles are, the more spicy they tend to be. And so, so this will give it that little bit of heat that we need. So if you're making the full recipe, you're gonna use 5 guajillo chiles. If you can't find guajillo, pasilla could be an alternative. If you can't find ancho, you can use like a chile negro as an alternative. So I'm using 5 of each of the chiles, and that's gonna give us a really nice base. And all we're gonna do is we're going to cook the chiles a little bit in a skillet just to make sure that they start to release their flavor, that they're getting like a nice little something before they go into the broth. So I'm just going to dry roast the chiles. You can pan fry them if you wanted to, really up to you. Either option is perfectly okay. So I'm gonna head over to the stove. I've already turned on this cast iron skillet that is in front of my pot of pozole. Let me not join the audio, there we go. And let me lower you all down so you can see even more towards the stove. All right, there we go. So you can see this cast iron skillet. I have it on about low medium heat. I'm gonna grab some tongs. So a couple things you wanna have ready, some tongs to make sure you're flipping them around unless you wanna do it with your hands, which I totally have done all the time. And then you also wanna have some water here. Sorry, not water, but some vegetable broth. So if you're making the full recipe, you're gonna wanna have 3 cups of vegetable broth ready. I have 1.5 cups. And essentially this is what I'm gonna use to rehydrate my chilies once they have been dry roasted. So I'm just going to place my chiles into my skillet. I hear a little bit of sizzling because I did wash these chiles earlier, as I mentioned. So there's a little bit of water on them. And it's gonna be really hard to see the slight blackening that will occur on the ancho chiles because they are already so dark. But if you are looking at it pretty closely, you'll be able to see a little bit of browning that will happen. And I'll lower this even more so. There we go. So it'll take about a minute or so on each side. And again, this is on about medium heat. You don't want it to be really, really hot because you'll just start smoking up all the chiles and everybody in your household will start coughing, which is pretty funny, but not always fun. And so you'll be able to see a little bit of that blackening happening more on the guajillos. It doesn't take very long, like I said, just about a minute. And what this does is it starts to allow the oils of the chile to release. It's gonna really enhance the flavor of the chiles. You'll start to really notice that the chiles become more fragrant and smell and taste so much more delicious.
Jocelyn, we have a question from Stephanie. She says, I think my guajillos weren't very good. It tastes a bit bland. I want to add chipotle because it's what I have. What are your thoughts?
Well, chipotle is a very, very star ingredient. Like it can take over the dish. I mean, I'll say that it'll probably taste really good, although it's not going to be sort of the traditional flavors of pozole, which is still fine. So if that's what you have on hand, please feel free to use it. And is it chipotles en adobo, or is it chipotle, dried chipotles that you're also going to rehydrate is another question, because they each have a slightly different flavor. And there's chipotle morita, chipotle meco, there's different varieties of chipotle out there. If you're using dried chipotle, you can go through the same process of what I'm doing here with these dried chiles, and then rehydrate them. If it's the chipotle en adobo, I would probably start with using a whole lot less of it and then slowly increment as needed, because those are really a quick pop of flavor. You don't have to add too much of it to feel like it's really flavoring the dish. So I am flipping my chiles over. Oh, and I turned up the wrong burner. So hopefully I turned up the back burner. I was like, why is this boiling out of control back here right now? You can see where how the pozole is looking back here. And I'll give my chiles just another few moments here before flipping those guajillos over. So this pozole is looking really good. And what you're essentially looking for is for the pozole to start to bloom. So this is how I really like my pozole. You can see here, this one closest to my tongs. And hopefully it's not too washed out. You can kind of see there is that the pozole essentially, it bursts. So it starts to really like bloom and pop. I really love pozole that looks like that and has that texture of that like popped kernel. So I'll let that keep going. Let me flip over these chiles. I'm curious to see how that chipotle ends up tasting in that pozole. I'm sure it's going to be really good. It's just going to taste like a different version of pozole, not quite the version that we are used to eating, but still going to be really delicious. Okay, so you can see here that I have a little bit of this blackening that's happened with my chile guajillo. You can see some of that there. That's as much as I want to go with the blackening. So if you blacken yours a lot more than that and they start to really burn and smoke, you're going to start to run into some bitterness, which you want to avoid. So try to just blacken them enough to, again, like wake up the flavors. And so that for me is enough. So that chile is ready to go. I'm going to lower the temperature here significantly on this front burner. And I'm going to start transferring my chiles to my cup and a half that I have here, because again, I'm making half the recipe of the vegetable broth. If you're making the full recipe, it's 3 cups of the vegetable broth. So I'm gonna go ahead and just throw those into my measuring cup here. If you had a bowl, you can totally use a bowl. And what you need to make sure to do is use your tongs or whatever you were using for the chiles and just really push them into that solution, into that liquid. So you can see here that they're all fully submerged in that liquid. And you can also leave the tongs on top. If you're using a bowl, you can use another bowl and place it on top of the chiles and make sure that they're getting pushed down into the liquid. And that needs to rehydrate for about 10 minutes. So we're just gonna set that aside, let it rehydrate. And I'm still over here at my stove. I'm going to just throw in my jackfruit. So now that the chiles have cooked, I'm gonna put my jackfruit in the same pan. They'll have a little bit of that slight flavor that'll be added because the chiles were just in here releasing their oils. And it's gonna be perfect because they're all gonna go really well together in this dish. So they're all getting kind of the same flavoring, the same treatment. All right, so I have all my jackfruit in here. And I like to cook my jackfruit for about 20, 25 minutes at least, if not more. At that point, you start to get into whatever you really prefer, whatever your personal preference is for the jackfruit. So, you know, some people like their jackfruit that's just cooked enough, and you can obviously tell that it's like slightly browned and it's cooked through. And then I actually prefer my jackfruit to be a bit more crispy. Although I will say that once you submerge the jackfruit into the pozole, it's gonna lose all its crispiness because it's obviously going into a hot liquid. But I just like that layer of flavor that you can add to the dish. So, you know, for example, for folks out there who maybe perhaps have cooked meat before, which is a lot of us, right? You know, we would do something similar, for example, with like chicken or meat, any meat where you like braise it, like you may sear it and brown it on all sides before you add it to the liquid to cook for a long period of time, versus just adding it to the liquid raw, because you're adding a layer of flavor to that dish. And that's essentially the same thing that I want to do here with this jackfruit. And with all I'm doing right now with this jackfruit is I'm just going through and checking to see if there's like any big chunks that I didn't break down earlier with my hands, making sure everything looks like it's coated really well. And the cool thing about jackfruit is it's not an ingredient that you really have to babysit. Like you don't have to be here the whole time turning it every second. Every few minutes or so, you should come and take a look at it. This is on about medium heat. And I love cooking jackfruit in my cast iron because I feel like it gives it a really nice crispiness. And the only things to look out for, if you are using, for example, like a stainless steel pan, you might have a little bit of sticking that happens. I would suggest, you know, right now I'm using a rubber spatula, or not rubber, but a silicone spatula. But I would suggest if you're using stainless steel to perhaps use like a wooden spoon or something that you can use to like kind of scrape and remove the bottom layer from sticking too much. And you might find that maybe you have to use a little bit more of the cooking oil just to keep it crisping and going. So it kind of depends on whatever you're using to cook your jackfruit. And essentially all you want to do is make sure that you're kind of picking whatever's on the bottom, the heat source, and flipping it over towards the top and just kind of making sure that your jackfruit is cooking evenly. So you can do that every couple minutes or so, and then come back and flip it over again and again. And just making sure that you're not burning the jackfruit. But I will say that jackfruit is a really resilient ingredient in that, like, even if you get a little bit of blackening that happens, you can just mix it all up with the, you know, all the rest of the jackfruit, and it still ends up being really good and works well in the dish, unless of course like you burn all of it, which is really, I find as much as I've cooked jackfruit, it's really hard to just like burn all of it. You might see that it starts to dry out, and that means that the jackfruit just needs a bit more moisture. So one thing that I didn't mention earlier as I was adding the oils is that jackfruit, again, is a fruit, right? It's literally a fruit that doesn't have any fat content to it. And if you really want your jackfruit to emulate this meaty texture and this meaty dish, you need to be able to add a little bit of fat to it to give it whatever you might feel texturally with a chicken or pork dish that has natural fats in it, right? So once it starts to dry out, you could potentially hit it with a little bit more oil, or alternatively, you could hit it with maybe some other liquid. It could be, you know, a bit of orange juice. It could be a little bit of lemon juice. Any juice that has some sugars in it are also going to help with the browning process, because sugars naturally brown with the heat source. So just an alternative, if you don't want to add any additional oil, you can use something else. So I'm going to let my jackfruit hang out for just a few moments here. And the other thing I'm going to add, not to my jackfruit, but I'm going to focus back on my pozole, is I'm going to, in a little bit, I'm going to blend up my chiles with and I can come back to this screen actually. So in a few minutes, This has probably been now soaking for just a few minutes since we've been talking and starting to cook our jackfruit. So I'll give it just a few more minutes. Again, this is like fully submerged in the liquid. What I'm looking for is our chiles that start to feel a little bit more soft and pliable, almost squishy or like really easy to tear. If you have a high power blender like I'm using, today I'm using a Vitamix, it's gonna be really easy to blend these until smooth. If you're using a home blender, you know, that isn't as powerful, then perhaps you can add some additional liquid. So again, this was the 3 cups of liquid, right? I'm using half right now, but essentially if you're using the full recipe, this was 3 cups of vegetable broth. And then you have an additional 2 cups of vegetable broth. So you could potentially use that if your blender is struggling to blend it. You can add a little bit more of this veggie broth, or you can blend it until it gets as smooth as it's gonna get for you. And then you can pass your chile solution through a fine mesh strainer, and that's gonna catch all the little chile bits that didn't quite blend up in your blender. So again, that's only if your blender is having a hard time getting all those little bits. And the other things I'm going to add when I add that chile solution to my pozole broth is I have a couple more ingredients. I have a little bit more cumino. So let me make sure I'm looking at this properly. I have a tablespoon of my ground cumin. And so again, that's gonna add a little bit more of that depth of flavor to the broth. And then I also have a teaspoon of dried Mexican oregano. So I have the whole leaves here. You can crush them if you want to. I like the look of the whole leaves because when they rehydrate, they obviously get a little bit bigger, and I think it just looks really beautiful in the broth. And then I'm also adding a couple bay leaves here because I'm just making half the recipe. I only have 1 dry bay leaf and a little bit of crushed black pepper here. This is just freshly ground black pepper. And lastly, of course, my salt. So salt to taste, however much you'd like. I probably should have added my own. I'm growing my own Mexican oregano and I dried these. So these leaves are much larger. I would probably crush these a little bit because you can see the difference in size there. This is homegrown versus store-bought. So up to you if you want to add, if you happen to be growing oregano in your garden, you can totally use that as well. So these are going to be sort of the main flavor profiles for our broth. I'm going to add those now. I'm going to go ahead and start blending up my chiles, and I'm going to get that broth just right. And again, you can add more things to the broth as you'd like. So I'm a huge fan of mushrooms. In fact, my neighbors next door made this recipe last night, but instead of using jackfruit, they used mushrooms, and it was super delicious. So you can definitely, you know, add whole mushrooms or mushroom powder, mushroom paste. That's going to add depth of flavor. There's a few things, obviously, kind of a lot of things that are, you know, in the vegan world that can add natural umami, such as nutritional yeast, liquid aminos, black garlic, you know, all these different things that you can add to make your broth so much more delicious. Another kind of secret ingredient that you could potentially use is if you have kombu, which is a seaweed, you could also cook your maize with kombu to give it even more of a richness and depth of flavor. That would make it even more, give it even more body. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop these into my broth right now. Again, that was the cumin, the oregano, the bay leaves, and the black pepper. So I'll go ahead and drop that in. And then I am going to season it with a little bit more salt here. And then I'm going to go ahead and start blending up my chiles right now. So I'm just gonna give my jackfruit here a little bit of attention. So I'm just gonna make sure that it's getting all mixed up properly, that it's cooking pretty well. There we go. And see, I see a large chunk here. I'm just gonna use my spatula to just break that down. You can see I'm already getting some of this nice brown color and texture there. So I want to keep that going. And again, if I start to see it looks like it's drying out, I can add those other liquid sources. So I'm going to go ahead and blend up my chiles. So all I'm gonna do is I'm going to pull my chiles out of the liquid, and you can see that they are so much more pliable, like they kind of wiggle around slightly. The longer you leave these, the more they'll do that. And in fact, if this was hot vegetable broth, they would rehydrate really quickly. So I'm just going to pull the chiles out with my tongs first and then pour the liquid in just to avoid splashing. Alternatively, what you typically see with you know, these recipes is you might see that the chiles might not be pan fried, that they'll just be put in hot water. That works fine too. I just like to add that additional layer of flavor. So I'm gonna go ahead and blend this up until it's nice and smooth, and I'll check to see if I need that additional vegetable broth in here to help blend it up. I think I need to plug in my blender first.
Jocelyn,
All right.
you added the bay leaves to?
To the pozole. So I added the cumin, the bay leaves, the pepper, the cumin, or I think I already said cumin, to the pozole. And then I'm about to add the chiles as well. All right, so let's take a look at this. So it's not as thick as a chile paste. You can see that it has a little bit of a slight runniness to it, right? And then when I open this up, I should have a pretty smooth paste, although it will, you know, stick to the back of the spoon. It should be pretty spicy. It has a nice hint of spiciness to it. And you can see kind of how thick and luscious that is. And I'm gonna go ahead and pour this solution into my pozole pot. Again, I don't see any bits of chile, so that's all been blended up pretty smoothly. If you do see any bits of chile, you could pass this through a strainer, as I mentioned. So up to you if you need to do that or not. So I'm going to grab another spatula here. I'll do this here first. And I'm just gonna clean my tamper. One thing that's really useful, this isn't a Vitamix commercial, but I mean, this tamper here that I'm scraping off is super helpful, because if you don't have this, you'd likely have to, you know, stop your blender while it's blending a couple times, like turn off the blender, take off the lid, use a spatula to scrape down the sides, and then remove the spatula, put the lid back on, turn it on, and let it continue blending. But this just kind of helps during the process to scrape down anything that's staying stuck to the sides of the blender and make sure that it's all getting down to the blade. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour this into my pot of pozole over on the stove. Again, I've already put in my bay leaves, my pepper, salt, cumin, oregano, and I'm just gonna scrape this all out. Make sure I get every little last bit of this chile as much as possible into the pot. And again, it's pretty smooth here. So it is all kind of going in. It's gonna blend in really nicely to this this caldito that we're making with the pozole, which I would consider to be its own broth, right? Like, because the corn has been cooking so long in there that that's essentially kind of like its own broth. It's like its own vegetable broth. We'll remove this blender out of the way. And I'm just going to come here with my wooden spoon and give this a nice mix. And let's see if you can see here. All right, so I have my pot of pozole here and I'm just mixed in the chile mixture. So now I have my pozole. Obviously I had the water it was cooking in, bay leaf, cumin, oregano, salt, pepper. You can see the nice color on there. I want my pozole to have some time to cook in this chile mixture. I'm gonna add in my additional couple cups here. In my case, I'm only adding a cup because I'm making half the recipe, but if you're making the whole recipe, you're gonna add an additional cup of vegetable broth. And secret ingredient here, which didn't get all the way blended in, but it'll dissolve, is instead of using, I didn't have time to make my own vegetable broth, which I can talk about how I do make my own vegetable broth in a moment. And instead of using a store-bought vegetable broth that's already in liquid form, you could use something, and I can pull it out so you can take a look. This is pretty easily available at a lot of grocery stores, especially health food stores right now. But I mentioned earlier that I have a bunch of pastes, right? So I have, which camera am I at? This one, okay. So this is called Better Than Bouillon. And essentially what it is, it's like a vegetable base. And you can use it to make a vegetable broth. So you would use, for example, a teaspoon of this paste and you mix it with hot water. I didn't heat up the water, I just kept it cold, which is why it didn't dissolve properly, but it will dissolve in my hot pot of pozole that you can see back there. So I just used a teaspoon of this. It's organic, it's all veggie based in a paste form. So it's essentially like a concentrated, reduced vegetable paste. And this is just my little trick. If I, excuse me, if I don't have time to make my own vegetable broth. I'm gonna take a sip of water because I think the chile is in the back of my throat. So any questions so far on any of this? Okay, I'm gonna transition back to my jackfruit and let me make sure you're all looking at that. So all I'm doing here is again, just mixing, making sure all looks good. I will say that this jackfruit for me does feel like it is kind of drying out slightly. It could use a bit more liquid. Again, you can hit it with oil, a bit more oil if you need to. You can hit it with a little bit of orange juice, lemon juice, whatever you have on hand that could potentially work. It could also be vegetable broth if you just wanted to use a broth and not get too much into oil. I'm just gonna hit it with just a touch more oil. And that's gonna help continue the browning process. I'll cook this jackfruit for maybe about another 5 minutes or so. And that will give my pozole some time to absorb some of this nice chile mixture that we put into the broth. And for the bay leaf to diffuse and for everything to kind of just start to kind of marry together. And I actually throw my jackfruit in just at the very end when I feel like my corn has cooked through, when I feel like the flavors are there in my pozole. That's when I add the jackfruit at the very end and I turn off the heat and I just let it all kind of come together. Another thing that I like to check on is I'm gonna taste the pozole and I'm tasting for a few things. I am tasting for salt, for spiciness, just for all around flavor. You want that broth to be really delicious. And you also want to taste a few of the kernels of corn. I would suggest at least 5 kernels of corn because, obviously some of the corn is sitting at the bottom and that's getting the most direct heat source. So if you just taste 1 kernel of corn and it was on the bottom, it might be like fully cooked and ready to go, but then you might have another few pieces of corn that still need a little bit more time to cook. So mix it around, taste at least 5 of them, make sure that they all feel nice and tender. And you can obviously give them a little bit more time if you feel like some of them feel like they're just a bit more undercooked. So I'm going to start to taste this just to kind of adjust right now while my corn is still cooking. So this piece of corn here is likely already you know, cooked through because it has burst. It's like that bloomed piece of corn. I'm like not in the shot. Here we go. So I am going to give that a taste. And that pozole broth has a nice little kick in the back of your throat with the chile. It's not overly spicy, just the right amount of spiciness. It probably could use a touch more salt, which I can add in a moment. We add a little bit more of the broth. And again, just tasting, this is like whoever's cooking in the kitchen gets the preview, right? You get to taste it first. That piece of corn is also well done. And I like it to feel like it's kind of like melting in your mouth kind of texture, like kind of a little bit fluffy, but still has like a tiny bit of structure and firmness. Let me give these two a taste. Yeah, they're all pretty done. One piece right now tasted like it could use a few more minutes. I'm gonna hit it with a little bit more of the touch of salt. And of course, if your pozole reduces down, like if you have it on the stove for quite some time with this chile broth solution, you could always hit it with a little bit more vegetable broth or a little bit more water if you need to. So I'm going to give my jackfruit just a few more minutes, as I mentioned. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come back to my cutting board and I'm going to just gather all my other ingredients that I need to complete this dish. So for pozole, obviously, there are, you know, the main ingredients, the maize, the chiles, the meat or the jackfruit, or like the meat alternative, right? But then there's also the toppings, which make it very much just as much fun as everything else. So I do have already here some tostadas. I just picked up tostadas at my local store. Lately, I've been really into buying baked tostadas, or you could bake them yourself. I didn't have time to do that today. But if you are baking them, you could really easily pick up some organic tortillas, maybe coat them with a little brushing of oil, place them in an oven at 350 until they're nice and crunchy. So you can do that. I like to use kernel of truth tortillas here at home. Again, I mentioned that they sell them at a few stores such as Cookbook Market in Highland Park, Echo Park, Sarah's Market in City Terrace, and Grassroots Market in South Pasadena. And they're just organic, non-GMO yellow corn tortillas. And you can easily bake those off and make crunchy tostadas with them. So tostadas are definitely a part of it. I'm gonna grab some green cabbage that I have in the fridge, some cilantro, some radishes. I'll break them down really quickly. It's a really straightforward and easy set of ingredients that are mostly here as toppings. And then we will start putting together and plating our dish. So let me grab that cabbage. And for this red pozole, I like to use green cabbage just because it's a nice contrast in color. And if you're making the green pozole, which is also in the book, I use a red cabbage or purple cabbage in that one. Again, for that contrast in color. So you have just like a real vibrancy there. And all I'm doing is I'm peeling these outer layers that look a bit sad, and I'm not going to be using those. I'll be composting those later. And I'm just going to cut a little bit of this now. A little slice off of it. And all you want to do for your cabbage is real simple. Just lay it down. I'm going to cut off that bottom bit. If you want to just create long strips, you could cut in either direction. I like to cut in the direction, like this is where the base was at or the root was at. So I'm just going to cut opposite of that. or I'm gonna cut as if I'm like growing up from the ground. And so you can just bear claw your hand and just simply cut really thin strips of your repollo or your cabbage. If these strips are too long, you can definitely cut them in half afterwards. So just cut all the way through, turn the pile, and just cut them in half. And so this just provides a little bit of crunchiness, a little bit of freshness. The repollo also, it gets, with the broth, it gets like, kind of like, I don't want to say melted in because obviously it doesn't melt in, but it definitely absorbs that hot liquid, and it becomes like really pliable and soft and just so delicious as a contrast in textures and flavors in this soup. And so you have here your nice repollo that's going to get added to the dish. So I'll add this on the side. And this is usually, if you haven't had pozole family style, this is typically served family style, like all the toppings will be on the side and everybody adds their, you know, bits of repollo, lemon, radish, whatever they like, is in as big of quantities as, or little quantities as they'd like. Let me grab my other ingredients. I have, of course, some cilantro. I have some radishes and some lemons that I just pulled off my tree. Let me check on my jackfruit for a moment. Just about there. I'm gonna lower the temperature a little bit. All right, so for these radishes, I like to leave the tail on. Don't ask me why, I just think it looks so cool. Obviously up to you, you can definitely remove that if you'd like. I just think it's, it just provides like another nice little look and feel. So I'm gonna cut my radish in half, and then I'm gonna put it cut side down. And you can cut slices, or you can just simply cut it in quarters if you'd like. If the quarters feel too big, then you can cut those quarters at an angle and cut them into eighths. So you can cut them this way, or obviously you can slice them. This piece of the radish looks a little sad, so I'm gonna cut that off completely and throw that in my compost pile. And then you can just keep slicing through. So adding that to my pile here of things that I'm going to top my pozole with. And again, cutting this in half and then cut side down, cut it in quarters, and then you can keep cutting here as much as you'd like. So I have here some nice little wedges of radish, but again, you could totally slice this. You can dice it up. You can do whatever it is. If you have a mandolin available and you want it to thinly slice, that is also really cool too, because you know, similar to what I was saying about the cabbage, you're going to start to find that the radishes, if they're really thinly sliced, they'll also kind of melt, not melt, but like really wilt into the broth as well. And then for the lemon, you could simply just cut off, you know, sides of the lemon like this and have these like nice pieces where you can see like all that beautiful juice of the lemon ready to go. Or you could cut wedges, whatever works best for you. So if you do get a wedge and it has like a weird edge there, you can just slice that off. Just have a sharp knife readily available so you can just start to put all those pieces together. I'll show you what the final dish is looking like in just a moment. And then the last thing I like to do for my cilantro is you could mince it up, but I actually prefer to tear off little leaves or little bunches of leaves of the cilantro. I think it looks so much cooler than mincing it up. So it becomes more of like this delicate garnish, which I really like. So you can get a few of those little leaves and bunches of cilantro, as many as you think that your guests will like. Obviously, this is a lot more time consuming. My staff at Todo Verde was always like, OMG, the cilantro. And I was like, let's get to it, because we're gonna pick all the leaves off. All right, And the stems you can use if you do end up using that method that I did, which is like a method. It's not really a method, just tearing the leaves off. You can use the stems to make a broth. You can blend it with some vegetable broth or some liquid, just water, to cook rice. And it'll make a really, really delicious cilantro rice. So definitely a lot you can do with that later. Or of course you can compost it. So I'm just gonna move my cutting board out of the way and I'm gonna start to get ready to assemble our final dish. Any other questions so far? All right, so I have my garnishes all ready to go. And I'm going to turn off my jackfruit. Let's come back to the stove here. Let's check on this jackfruit. You can see here that my jackfruit is nice and brown. You can see that it's like slightly crisped up. The color in general is brown all around, even more so. Oh, and they're stapling right above me. Sorry about that. Or they're nailing with a nail gun. So this is the texture I'm looking for. This like nice cooked shredded jackfruit. I'm gonna turn off the heat on that. And I'm going to just simply transfer all this jackfruit into my pot of pozole. So I'm gonna back you up a little bit so maybe you can see that. And so I'm just going to lift up my hot pan, being really careful, and just simply toss all of that jackfruit into my pot of pozole. I just turned off the heat for the pot of pozole as well. So this is all pretty cooked, ready to go. Just needs to be put together. You could bring it to simmer and cook the jackfruit in there if you wanted to. I don't think it's necessary. It's all pretty cooked through. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just going to trade places. I'll bring this forward just to avoid making a big old mess. So I'm gonna bring my olla forward and I'll bring my cast iron back and I will bring you all to the olla. So you should be able to see this nice olla of pozole. And so all I'm doing is I'm mixing together all the jackfruit into the pozole. And you can see here the consistency that I'm looking for or that I like. So it definitely feels like it has enough liquid in it, but it's still heavily textured with the corn and the jackfruit, so it doesn't feel watery to me. You can definitely add more liquid if you prefer your broth to be a little bit more loose. I'm gonna give this one last taste here. I'm just gonna pour this into my spoon to give it a taste. Make sure everything feels nice and melded together. So I should be able to taste a little bit of oregano, a little bit of bay leaf, a little bit of that salt, the chiles, the corn, the jackfruit. Yeah, and that is all ready to go. So this pozole is really, really nice and warming and rich. So the last thing I will do is pour this, just ladle some of this into a bowl that I have here. I'm gonna grab a ladle. And I'm just going to ladle into my bowl. I'm using a green bowl here just to have a nice contrast in color. Making sure that I'm getting a nice amount of broth as well as a nice amount of the elements that are giving this pozole a nice texture. And I'll come back to my laptop here. And so I'm gonna just pan down and you should be able to see our final dishes here. So these are all our garnishes, obviously. We have our hot pozole, which is nice and steaming. And you can see that nice texture of the corn with the jackfruit. That broth has a nice body to it. So the broth doesn't feel to me like it's too watery. I like this texture of the broth. I feel like it has even more flavor when it isn't too watered down. but everybody has their own family recipe. So if you prefer yours to be a little bit more loose or even thicker, really up to you. You can keep cooking it down slightly if you need to. You can add more liquid if you'd like. This is just my preference of how I prefer my pozole. And then the way I would finish it off is obviously starting with a little bit of that repollo and adding that to the top of my pozole here. Add a nice little bit of that. You can put in some little bits of radish, just kind of just poking into the broth because I want them to kind of warm through a little bit. So you can pick up whatever pieces of radishes that you'd like. And then you can do a little squeeze of lemon over the top of everything. Of course, if you have lime available, you can use lime. I, throughout the book, use lemon because, and also with Todo Verde, because it's an ingredient that is grown locally here in Los Angeles. And so I want to make sure to use as many local ingredients as possible, just so that we don't have to import things from Mexico if we don't have to, if we have something that's like pretty similar and comparable. Last thing is that garnish of the cilantro as much as you'd like. And of course, that tostada. So I kind of just like to wedge the tostada in there, but you can obviously break it up into pieces or do whatever you need to do to make sure that it's on point. Salt, if you'd like more salt, I love salt. So I'd be that crazy person with flaky salt. I actually have some salt here that I used to rim a margarita the other night for another class. And I just zested some lemon and some lime and some grapefruit zest into it. But you can see that the salt crystals are like really flaky and large. Like something like this would be like so delicious to just crumble over the top. Obviously that's not necessary, but just another added crunchy texture of the salt with a little bit more of that citrus note to it. So any questions as we wrap up our class right now for this pozole dish? Obviously the plate also helps to make it pop. So if you have really cool plates to ladle the pozole into, that makes all the difference too.